All right. And another thing I do want to mention, I started teaching at UCR, so as you notice, my environment is a little bit different. If I'm a little bit late to getting started, hang out in the waiting room. I'll get in as soon as possible. Last Monday, I had some issues because starting at UCR, where I typically try to set up space, somebody had occupied that room. So that's a one-off, right? But bear with me. If I am a little bit late because I'm transitioning or driving out here, I'll get set up for you and we'll have class. But just know that sometimes it may be a little bit late just because I'm transitioning. Okay, so let me share our screen. What we'll do is we'll go through the study guide. It's up to you whether you want to take time to answer the questions or you just want to move through the study guide. Today's course, as well as Monday's course, will be dedicated purely to the study guide. Make this what you need it to be, right? This is dedicated strictly to get you prepared and comfortable with the study, with the midterm. On Thursday, it will be available for you to look at. It will be due at the end of the day next Monday, okay? It's on Canvas. It's in the same module with your midterm study guide. You'll also see in that module a space to submit your journals. You may not see the midterm now because it won't be available until Thursday. So I just want to kind of make you aware of those housekeeping things. Let me pull up the study guide. 1 second. All right. So a couple of things I want to point out, right? So we know it's about 5 essay questions. You're required to answer 3 of the 5 questions. You're also required, let me see, we go over these. Let me see something real quick, 1 second. Yes, okay. You're also required to implement a theoretical framework. Now, I've very clearly stated for you the first theoretical framework, and that came with the first lecture of the semester, the one on African American male theory, the theoretical framework being African American male theory. What we'll do today is make sure that you all have an understanding of the other theoretical frameworks that you can use and how to use them to help answer the questions. The other theoretical frameworks will kind of present themselves as we move the remainder of the semester. But again, for your midterm, you're going to have those incorporated into your answer. And I'll give examples of what that may look and sound like, okay? So what we'll have to do and what will get you points is 1, the use of the theoretical framework. 2, making sure that you answer each question in their entirety, right? As I mentioned last week, it may be 1 question, but within 1 question, you'll have about 3 to 4 sub-questions. And if you're not addressing or not being attentive to all of the sub-questions, then you will not get full points on the question, right? So let's start here with the theoretical frameworks. We know from the first week of course material that we have the theoretical framework of African American male theory. I mentioned at the first week of course that I look at this theory to be encompassing of all African people, not just boys and males, how it's articulated here, right? But what's important to note as it pertains to this theory, African people are born with an innate desire for self-determination and with an unlimited capacity for morality and intelligence, right? That's what you really want to take away from this theoretical framework. So again, the theory is African American male theory, what we'll call for this class African theory, because it applies to all African people, not just boys and men. The framework states that African people are born with an innate desire for self-determination and with an unlimited capacity for morality and intelligence, right? Now, if you think about the material that we've engaged throughout the semester, all of the readings have kind of echoed at some capacity this notion of African people being born with an innate capacity for morality, intelligence, and a desire for self-determination, right? So again, we know that theory is this termed African American male theory, right? The framework is the notion that African people are born with an innate desire for self-determination and with a limited capacity for morality and intelligence, excuse me. So that's the first theoretical framework. The second theoretical framework is this notion, it comes out of critical race theory, right? This is where the theory comes out of. And again, that's critical race theory, or CRT. The framework is counter storytelling, right? So when you think about counter storytelling, or when you hear counter storytelling, it's the process of telling the narratives, it's the process of telling stories from the vantage point of those who are marginalized, or those who are oppressed, right? So for example, if we're going to tell the discovery of the Americas, right? And this is apropos for what the so-called holiday is today. We're not going to tell the discovery of the Americas from the vantage point of Columbus, right? Because that would be the dominant narrative. For your counter storytelling, you're going to tell this story, you're going to tell this narrative from the vantage point of the natives, or the indigenous folks that were here prior to arrival. Does that make sense? So this is what this notion of counter storytelling is, right? If you think about what we've been doing throughout the majority of the semester, right? All of the material at some standpoint is a counter storytelling or a counter narrative, because it's not telling the happenings from the standpoint of dominant culture, but from the standpoint of the subjugated or the marginalized, right? So again, this notion of counter storytelling, which comes out of critical race theory, is the idea of telling stories, understanding narratives from the standpoint or the vantage point of the dominated or the subjugated, not the dominant culture, right? Or the prioritarist culture, mostly Euro-American culture, right? The example I provided, if we're thinking about the discovery of America, we're not going to tell that story from Columbus's vantage point, but we'll tell that story from the indigenous people who were on this land prior to Columbus's arrival. So the third critical framework that you have to use, that you can use for your questions, to answer your questions, is called funds of knowledge. Now, what funds of knowledge does, it focuses on the importance of family units, community structures, and the knowledge that comes from these family units or community structures, right? So it recognizes that there is knowledge that is produced from community, there is knowledge that's produced from family, and that knowledge can be brought into the classroom, it can be brought into academic spaces, and it should be recognized and honored, okay? So this is this idea of funds of knowledge. Now, we talked about this notion of fugitivity in passing, but not very explicitly. So what this idea of fugitivity stems from, if we're thinking about the plantation society, right? And in the context of the plantation society, African people are considered to be property, right? So in the event, at the moment that an African person decides to liberate themselves from the plantation, they at that moment become fugitive, right? And if they are able to successfully navigate off of the plantation, they are engaging in this act of fugitivity, because once you leave the plantation, you know that you could always be brought back, right? Your freedom is not guaranteed once you go out of the parameters of the plantation. They'll send, you know, the catchers after you, right? And again, I think I mentioned earlier in the semester that these enslavement catchers are the original impetus, or the origination of our modern day police force, right? So this notion, or this act of fugitivity, is this idea of being in a constant state of flight from captivity, right? And you know that once you've escaped, that constant notion of being captured still is prevalent, right? So you have to always be in flight. You have to always be covering your tracks, right? So this is this idea of fugitivity. Don't really worry about maroonage too much. We didn't get into that, and I don't believe we will. So don't use that as a theoretical framework. But what I just will quickly speak to that. But this idea of maroonage is tied to fugitivity, right? This notion of once you've gotten away, once you've been in the process of escape or in constant state of flight, there were maroon communities who were able to set up freedom spaces for those enslaved Africans who escaped, right? And there's still maroon communities to this day in spaces like Florida, in spaces like the Carolinas, where these African people were able to escape enslavement and stay and set up these indigenous African safety spaces for those who were practicing the idea or the act of fugitivity. So again, don't worry about that too much as it pertains to using that for an answer to your question. Focus on the African American male theory, counter storytelling, excuse me, and funds of knowledge and fugitivity. Those will be the main ones that you'll use to help support your questions. Does anyone, and again, this is your time, so don't be bashful, right? Does anyone have questions about the theoretical frameworks that we've covered? I'm going to give you an example of how you use those to help support your questions, your answers to your questions, excuse me. But does anyone have questions about the theoretical frameworks now? So what I'll do, is I'll scroll back up to the top, right? And then I'll talk to you about how you could use these theoretical frameworks to help support your answer and what I'll be looking for to make sure you're getting your points for using your theoretical framework, right? So starting about at the top, how old are African people? Now, there's three acceptable answers: 8 million years old, 3.2 million years old, or the more appropriate answer, which is unknown, right? And I say the reason the unknown is the more appropriate answer because quite literally, the more research that's being produced, the more excavation that's happening, the older African people become. So really the most accurate answer is unknown. But if you're going to use unknown on the midterm, right, you must state why it's unknown. And that why is because the more they dig, the more they excavate, the older African people become, right? So those are the three acceptable answers for how old African people are: 3.2 million years old, 7 to 8 million years old, or unknown. Unknown being the more research is done, the more excavation takes place, the older African people become, right? I'll also may ask you, name for me an African individual prior to European contact and what are their significance, right? So we have Narmer, we have Imhotep, we have Akhenaten, we have Taharka, we have Mansa Musa. These are all African individuals prior to European contact and some of their significant contributions. There are others that were offered in the lecture. I do believe that lecture is posted online. If it's not, let me know and I can post that for you. But if not, these are sufficient, and this will help you answer the question. Now, as it pertains to the questions on the midterm, right? This is what a question may look and sound like. Answer for me, how old are African people? Name for me an African individual prior to European contact and their significant contributions. And state for me why this information is important as it pertains to epistemology or knowledge production in the university, right? So again, how old are African people? Name for me an African individual and their significant contributions prior to European contact. Why does this information become important within the realm of the academia as it pertains to knowledge production, right? So within that one question, there's about 4 sub-questions, correct? So you would have to answer each component of those sub-questions, and you would have to use a theoretical framework to help support your answer, okay? So if we're going to use this example that I just read out for you and try to answer the question using a theoretical framework, it may sound like this, right? Using African American male theory to support my answer, African people are dated to be unknown, right? They're unknown because the more research is done, the more excavation that takes place, the older they become. African American male theory states that African people are born with innate capacity for self-determination, a limited capacity for morality and intelligence. One individual that exhibits this capacity for morality and intelligence is Imhotep. He's an astrologer, he's a philosopher, he's the world's first architect. He also engaged in some forms of medicine. These acts alone makes him the embodiment of this notion of being born with innate capacity for morality as is stated in African American male theory. This information becomes important as it pertains to the world of academia because it shifts the radix point of knowledge production not taking place solely in Europe, but also having African origins. Right. So you see within my example, I'm using the framework to help support my answer, and I'm making sure to address each component of the question. Does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about what I've just kind of displayed for you? Because quite literally, that's how the questions will sound and feel like they'll be that dense. So I want to make sure that you all feel comfortable being able to address every aspect of the question, and then also be comfortable being able to use those theoretical frameworks to support your answers. Any questions? All right. What we'll do then is we'll kind of work our way through readings. We didn't get to Baldwin yet. So we flip this out. Okay. So what we'll probably have to do is I'll probably end up giving you 3 questions and asking you to answer 2 because we haven't got to these 2 as of yet. And I can't hold you accountable for those. And realistically, we will probably not read this Herstian Mutants of Men. So what we'll do is we'll work through Water and Spirit, we'll work through Decolonizing the Mind, and we'll work through Poetics of Relation because those are the information that we've engaged. And then we do also have the Teachers of Ptah-hotep. So I might throw a bonus question in on that, and I'll make it a bonus question. Okay. So we're thinking about Malidoma Somays of Water and Spirit. So think about the opening sentence of the text, right? And he talks about the importance for names. Well, before I go too far, do you all want to take the time to answer the questions, or do you want me just to kind of go through them and you could go, take your own time to answer them? It's totally up to you. What we could also do is, if you do decide to answer the questions, you could try to use a theoretical framework to help you answer the question, so that way you're getting comfortable with that process. But again, it's totally up to y'all. So if you feel like we don't need to do all that, we don't have to. But I want to do what is required to make you all feel prepared and comfortable. So how do you want to approach this next portion of the course? Go ahead, Jay.
Do you think you can go over how to use the framework again for like let's say like some of the water?
Okay. So how about this? What we'll do is you go over, not you in particular, but you as a class, right? You have what these frameworks are. Think about what framework is going to best fit what the reading material is. And we could tease out that through conversation, right? So do you all agree? Just to me, that's what I found is the best way for you all to get comfortable with the frameworks and to prepare you all for your midterms. But again, it's up to y'all. So is that y'all cool with that, or what you want to do?
I had a question.
Go ahead, Kyle.
So all we're doing is just applying the theoretical frameworks to the readings, and that was it?
No, you're gonna use those theoretical frameworks to help you answer the question that's gonna be on the midterm, right? So each midterm is gonna be composed of essay questions. As you're seeking to address or answer those questions, I'm going to be looking for you to use these frameworks to help support your answer, right? So the example that I gave was, how old are African people, right? So you would say, well, I said, how old are African people, and name for me an African individual prior to European contact in their contribution, right? That's the question. Then the framework that could be used is African American male theory, because that framework states that African people are born with this innate capacity for intelligence, right? So if that's what the framework or the theory states, you will use that theory to help support your answer. So if the question is asking me, name your African individual prior to European contact, I'm going to say, well, African American male theory helps me answer this question because it situates the intelligence of African people at birth. One of those people being Imhotep.
All right.
You see how you're able to both, you're using this to support what you're answering. I know Eric.
It's the evidence.
Okay. I know Eric had his hand up and then we'll go to Kevin. Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I did have my hand. I was just trying to like bring the thumbs up down. Thank you.
Kevin, you had your hand up?
So I put it in the chat. I messaged you. I said, do we have to do all the readings and write an essay for each one, or do we have to pick one of them and then answer all the questions on it, like the 3 questions that
So keep in mind, this is a study guide. This is not the actual midterm. In the midterm, there'll be questions that you'll have to answer based on the readings, right? So you won't it won't be up to you to determine what readings you'll be engaged. It'll be based off the question that you're answering. So for example, let's just say question 2 deals with water and spirit. Question 3 deals with Glissant, poetics of relation, right? So if you're choosing question 2 and question 4, then those will be the readings that you're engaging to answer that question about that particular reading. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like in the actual midterm, it's going to be like, oh, this question is water of spirit. This one is the Glissant, and then this one is like so and so and so and so.
Perfect. Yep. That's exactly.
And then we just write a paragraph for each one, or is it just an essay?
So it's really up to you and how you answer the question, right? I don't believe that a paragraph would allow you to succinctly answer or sufficiently answer the questions how they'll be loaded. So it's probably going to be a little bit more than a paragraph. But if you're able to pull off answering every component of that question and using a theoretical framework within a paragraph, more power to you, right? I'm not grading on the length. I'm grading on how comprehensive you are about answering the question and the use of the framework. That makes sense? Cool. All right. Good question. And here, let me do this because I can't see everybody with the screen being shared. And that's why I missed your message, Kevin. So far as how we want to proceed with the rest of the day and getting you all prepped for the midterm, would you rather go through the questions? I know Jay said, Eric said he's cool with going through the questions and answering the questions and trying to use those frameworks. How is everybody else feeling? What would you rather do? I only heard from one of you. Kevin said, yeah. All right, so it looks like I've seen some head nods. All right, bet. So what we'll do is we'll go through the material about each reading, and then we'll kind of discuss what we feel is the answer to that particular question about the reading, and then we'll talk about what framework fits within that particular reading. So again, looking at sommets of water and spirit, the questions posed: what is the significance of the name in the African context? What does this mean for the author of the text, right? And we know, why does Sommet situate the importance of names within his community, the Dakara?
I think it was because the names are like what their duties are in like society or what their responsibilities are. Like it gives like it's just like a label as to what they're assigned to do in life.
Correct. And then so I'm sorry, go ahead.
It determines their destiny.
Yes. Perfect. Yep. Thank you, Amanda. So we know that why names become important within the context of the text. So what does it mean for Malidoma Sommet? What does his name mean, and why does it cause him to write the text?
I think it meant befriend the enemy, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Perfect. Yep. And so essentially the book, which becomes of water and spirit, is his project of sorts that allows him to manifest his destiny, right? And he talks about within that opening chapter that you all read is how he's designed to mend, the two worlds, right? The world of the white world and the world of his people. And his book is his attempts to do so, right? The difficulty of the English language as a means of effectively translating African occurrences. What does this mean for Somé? So he talks about why the English language can't encapsulate some of the things that happened within his community. He talks about what happens when translation is done. What are some of those things?
Oh, one of my AirPods died. But it's kind of like erasing like culture, erasing like the meaning of your name.
Okay. Well, let's keep it to language though, right? Because he's asking, he says quite specifically what happens when a translation is done to language. And you're right, there isn't a form of an erasure that takes place, Kevin. But we want to, for the purposes of answering the question, right, we want to keep it to where the question is at. In this case, we're dealing with language. What else does he talk about why English language can't also often articulate African phenomena? One, he says there's a violence that's done when any type of translation takes place, right? And then I also explained within the lecture that there's things that take place within the world of the Dagara that English does not even account for, right? And I told you the example of his father's or his grandfather's burial processions, right? And how the vases that were on the floor were mixed with the ancient medicine, and the herbs were thrown onto the vases, and they begin to elevate, and they're on the roof, right? And I tell the story of how those herbs caused the grandfather to wake up off of his deathbed and dance a few miles to his burial site, right? And I talked about how in the English conceptualization, in the westernized conceptualization of death, once someone takes their last breath, they're not able to get up and move and dance, right? I talked about in the Western conceptualization of gravity and how that works, things that are on the floor cannot levitate and stick to the ceiling, right? So Malidoma says there's a level of violence that occurs when any form of translation is done. And there's no words oftentimes within the English language that can articulate the complexities of African phenomena, right? And it says, how does one's culture shape one's understanding of what can be and what is considered to be real? And this, think back to the experiment that Malidoma did with his elders in the Star Trek videos, right? That if you can remember that, this will help you kind of answer that question. So what are, or how does one's culture shape one's understanding of what perceived to be reality? So the way that he talks about this is through, again, the experiment that he did with Star Trek. He shows his elders things like Spock, things like time travel, right? And he articulates that for his elders, supernatural is natural. Go ahead, Kevin.
It's kind of like in Star Trek or like Star Wars or something. It's like all like sci-fi, like nonfiction, but in reality, that was already happening for them. Like it was nothing new. So seeing all of it was just like, okay, and what?
Perfect. Yes. So again, so think about what the question is, right? So for Malidoma's culture, what the Americans, what the westernized world perceives as supernatural is normal, right? So this is how one's culture shapes how you perceive the world to be, right? Again, using the example I gave before, in Malidoma's culture, for someone to have made their transition and get up off of their deathbed, that's normal, right? But in our world, in our Western understanding, those things don't happen. Matter of fact, they don't happen, it's impossible, right? So these are the ways, and these are examples of how one's culture can shape one's understanding of what's real. So I think this next question, right? How does Somé problematize notions of primitivism and modernization? This also speaks to the notion of the Star Trek experiment and what Kevin is pointing us to, right? So if this so-called third world country, if this so-called primitive people are able to see things like time travel as something that's normal, if they're able to perceive mythical beings as something that's normal, if these things that are what the Western world perceives to be as their future are happening in these spaces that are so-called third world or so-called primitive, right? This is the way that Somé is problematizing the notion of what's modern and the notion of what's archaic, right? In fact, in the passage, he says, wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as primitive as my ancestors, right? Because again, that goes back to what Kevin was telling us. A lot of the things that is happening in the Western world's future via sci-fi has already been happening for African folks since antiquity, right? So really, if that's the case, who is modern and who is ancient? Does that make sense? This is how so this idea of problematization, to problematize something, is to like make it a problem, right? Conventionally, we understand that so-called third world countries are not as advanced as Western or first world countries, right? That's what we call a common sense notion. But to make a problem out of that is to show how that's not necessarily the case. And so May does a masterful job of doing that with his example of Star Trek, right? So May talks about the solution to alienation that's produced by modernity, right? So he's saying that modernity, this idea of the modern, has produced a form of alienation, right? And he offers a solution to this form of alienation, excuse me, which is a connection with your ancestors. And I believe at the time of the lecture, I talked about how for most indigenous people, for most indigenous cultures, a connection with the ancestors is very prevalent, right? And even if you look at like Disney, they also speak to this. For example, the film Coco, right? If you think about what the premise of that film Coco is, strictly about honoring one's ancestors, right? I believe it's Mulan, right? That is an example of the Asian descendant community honoring their ancestors. Even if you look at like the Black Panther films, right? Those are examples of African people honoring their ancestors. So these are examples of indigenous cultures having an intimate connection with their ancestors. So May, the author of Water and Spirit, is arguing this is how you resolve the issue of alienation that this notion of modernity has produced, that the modern has produced, by establishing a connection with your ancestors. Okay. So thinking about what was discussed as it pertains to this reading, okay? We have about 4 theoretical frameworks. African American male theory, which states African people are born with innate desire for self-determination and with an unlimited capacity for morality and intelligence, right? Critical race theories counter storytelling, stories that are being told from the marginalized culture, not the dominant culture, right, or the westernized European culture. Funds of knowledge, knowledge that gets passed down from one generation to the next via family, via community, that often is not recognized within academic spaces, but should be, right? Or this notion of fugitivity, the act of stealing oneself, to be in constant state of flight. Now, out of these frameworks, which do you think would best help you answer the questions that we've just thought about as it pertains to of water and spirit?
Critical race theory.
So critical race theory and the framework is counter storytelling. Why do you feel counter storytelling will work?
Because it's mainly focusing on like focusing on what's it called? On African culture rather than Western culture. And it's instead of like focusing more on the Western culture, you're getting the story side of African culture. You're not getting the Western side, you're getting the actual like story
Yeah.
that's like told by an African person.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. That's a spot on answer, right? So if it was not counter storytelling, this story would be told from like the French Jesuits, right? From the French missionaries. But because it's being a counter storytelling, because it's being told from Maladoma's Spanish point, it absolutely becomes critical race theory's counter storytelling. Perfect. Um, it's all good. All right. Anyone else? We have critical race theories, kind of storytelling. Obviously, that works. What other theoretical frameworks can be placed within the Maladoma maze of water and spirit?
The first one.
Okay. African theory. Why African theory, Amanda?
Because weren't we talking about how like the names reveal their destinies? So it's like they're born with an innate desire for self-determination.
Right.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Absolutely. Right. Anyone else?
I was also thinking funds of knowledge,
Okay.
just because like Maladoma, his duty was to build community or bring communities together rather than separate them. And also I think his sharing of knowledge was also on a communal level. And so it was to increase that knowledge to other people or to other like areas. So I guess that's why I don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, In fact, I would argue you're all right. Probably the only one that wouldn't work, if any, would be well, I mean, one, I was gonna say fugitivity would not work, but if you know the full story, it could be argued that it works. But you guys didn't read all that, so don't worry about it. But I think we're right where we need to be in the sense of African American male theory. That's a great one. Critical race theories, kind of storytelling, and funds of knowledge. Those are all spot on frameworks to help you support or help you think about the reading being, which is of water and spirit. Jay, go ahead.
Which one do you think is the best one for like which framework works the best, like out of all of them?
So here's the. I'm glad you asked that because here's the trick bag, right? Like I'm gonna be real with y'all. They all fucking work. They all work. It's just about how you articulate your why. And they all worked because each of them had his and I'm thinking about those who responded, Eric, Amanda, and Kevin, right? They each had a different reason as to why they chose those frameworks, and they all made sense, so you would get credit for it. So to be honest with you, there's no real reason why you should not get your points for the theoretical framework. It's just you're not doing it, right? Because it's really about explaining why you chose that. They all fit. Um, Also, you could use one theoretical framework multiple times. You don't have to, deviate, or you don't have to use all of them. You can use the same one over and over if that makes sense to you, right? But what's important is that you explain your rationale for why you chose that. If you can't make it make sense to me, then you won't get the credit, right? So your capacity to be able to explain why you chose that is going to be foundational for you to get the grade. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions before we move on to the next reading? All right. So thinking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, um, we read this, right? Am I tripping? Yeah, I have so many different classes. I want to make sure that we. Does this sound familiar to you? Yeah. Okay. Um, so if you could think back for this reading, and it may be wise if y'all have your journals at handy to get those out, because this could help you kind of think through some of these questions. What, according to Ngugi, what is the cause of the problems in Africa? And again, if you're thinking about the reading and the thesis of the reading, this notion of language, right? Um, what is the cause of issues in Africa according to Ngugi and Ngugi?
Was it imperialism?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Imperialism and the tribalism that is produced through imperialism, right? And this is why language, and this is how language kind of takes center fold, because he tells you all the various languages within Africa. Africa has the most linguistic diversity of any continent in the world. This is what he talks about is the problem. And again, this is a problem that is a byproduct of imperialism. Perfect. How does Ngugi understand the role of language as it pertains to shaping culture? What's the role of language for shaping culture according to Ngugi? And it's not too far off from how how Somé is thinking about culture's ability to shape reality, right? If you think about how that question was answered, it would allow you to kind of think about what's being discussed here as it pertains to um, how Ngugi is thinking about language.
I think maybe he like understands like how language is it's like because it's like one of the most significant part of like someone's culture or their heritage, it's also like related to how they like define themselves or like how they like act in like their environment or how they see their environment.
Absolutely. And Ngugi argues it's foundational for how someone understands themselves, right? And for my bilingual students in the class, right? Think about how you even think in one language in the process of having to cognitively translate that from your mind to your mouth in a different language, and how important just the freedom of being able to think something and speak it is opposed to that translation process. Also thinking about what Somé says, the violence that gets done, right, when you have to translate. So yes, language is vital. It's essential to shaping culture. He talks about the Conference of African Writers of the English Language, or I think it's titled the Conference of African Writers of the English Expression, and where he mentions that no matter what your status is, you can be a PhD holder, you can be a world-renowned poet, but if you did not produce your work in English, you would not be able to attend that conference, right? So why does he argue that this conference is significant?
Culture bombing, right? Where um, it's like you're basically erasing the language that you speak natively and you're westernizing it for people that are Western.
Perfect. So, and this notion of culture bombing is to destroy a people's belief in their native culture and their native customs, right? And if you're going to have a conference that only recognizes a colonial language, then you're devaluing your native customs and culture, right? And this is why he points out the fact that even someone who is a PhD holder or a world-renowned poet, if they wrote and produced in an African language, they would not be able to attend, right? That there's a fundamental issue there when someone is more qualified to be in speaking spaces, but is not able to attend because they want to use their native tongue, right? Whereas someone who is less qualified is able to occupy a space because they choose to produce work in the tongue and the language of their oppressor. There's a contradiction at play there that Ngugi is pointing us to, right? He says that the impetus, the physical subjugation is colonialism, and the impetus of spiritual subjugation is how they colonize the idea of God, right? This is what he argues as the impetus for not only physical and spiritual subjugation. But thinking about the work of Ngugi, someone besides Eric, Amanda, and Kevin, what theoretical frameworks would you be able to implement for thinking about the work of Ngugi and his contentions around the importance of your native language?
I'm sorry, but you think you can repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so based off what we heard about Ngugi, right, and his thoughts around language and the importance of using your native language, what theoretical framework, African American male theory, critical race theories, counter storytelling, funds of knowledge, or fugitivity would you use to best kind of place this reading in? Go ahead, Abigail.
The funds of knowledge.
Okay, why funds of knowledge?
We talk about the importance of family and community that involve anything with language or anything related to culture.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one of the primary ways that language gets passed down from generation to generation is through family, is through community, right? So funds of knowledge would absolutely fit within thinking about what Ngugi is up to. Anyone else? What other theoretical frameworks would fit for Ngugi's decolonizing of the mind? Kevin?
Me personally, I think fugitivity,
Okay.
because it's talking about culture bombing and how like instead of like westernizing it, they should like instead of like I forgot what the word was, but it's kind of like you embrace it. Yeah, that's the word. Embrace your like your culture instead of like having to translate it for westernized.
I like that, Kevin, because it's almost like a stealing back the importance of your
Mhm.
culture. And that's where the fugitivity comes in, right? Where in the plantation context, you're thinking about literally stealing yourself, but within the context of what Ngugi is up to, it's about like stealing the importance of your culture back from this dominated culture and this bomb and the effects of this cultural bomb. So absolutely, that would be a great theoretical framework. Anyone else with theoretical framework can accompany or helps you think about the work of Ngugi?
I just have a question. Could it be the first one?
Okay. Why
Sorry.
why do you think it could be the first one?
I just feel like because since it has to do with like having your like language and like with the culture bombing, like you have the self-determination to like take back what is yours and like have what is yours when it comes to like the way you talk and how your language is presented to itself. So I just thought like it would be the self-determination to learn and like, just take that leap of like taking it back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also within that, Jay, right, let's not escape or forget the aspect of they're born, right? They're born with an innate desire, right? So if you come out of the womb like this is the language that you come out of the womb speaking, right? You don't know that your language is primitive until outside circumstances start to tell you that, right? So I think you're absolutely right in situating African American male theory from what you stated, but also this notion of someone being born with this self-determination, right? So again, I heard how you phrased your statement to me in the form of a question, right? But I threw the question back to you just because it's really not about, again, which one you chose, but more so how you're able to articulate why you chose it. So you were right, really. And again, trick bag, right? Like it's not even a trick bag. You can't be wrong if you explain the shit right. So it's really about your ability to articulate your why. Let's see. Okay, we'll go through poetics of relations. And then what we'll do for Wednesday, we'll go over the teacher of Ptahhotep. I think that's one text that is not on here that we'll cover on Wednesday. So thinking about Glissant's poetics of relation, which should be fairly fresh for y'all because we just covered that not too long ago. How does the juxtaposition of the written and the oral manifest according to Glissant? So he says there's the first written confrontation between the written and the oral, right? And he talks about what the only thing written on the enslavement ship was, and he talks about the cries that are stifled, which is this notion of the oral. Expand upon that. What is the difference? What is this juxtaposition that Glissant's talking about between the written and the oral? So when he talks about the only thing written on the enslavement ship, what is that? And I pointed you all to the fact that this thing is the first step, right? Is one of the documentation process of making someone inhuman, right? What is this thing?
Their value.
Correct. Perfect, Kyle. So it's the ledger, right? It's the receipt book that tracks the value of everyone who was kidnapped and placed on the bottom of that ship, right? So that's the written thing. He said that's the only thing written on this ship is that, excuse me, is that ledger or that the books that states each value of the enslaved, right? So the oral, and I kind of pointed you all to it, but the oral is the stifling of the cries, right? And I said at the time of the lecture, right, that when you get harmed, when you get beat, when you get whipped upon, right, the natural thing to do is cry out. Right? That's a natural response. That's a human response. And to stifle or to prevent those cries is to kind of another attempt to prevent those acts of humanity, right? And he says that this confrontation reverberates and it continues on into the plantation, right? Why is the open boat symbolic? What is Glissant provoking in his readings to envision? What is the significance of the belly of the boat being pregnant? So let's deal with the first part. What is the open boat a symbol for? And how does this become symbolic?
The open boat, like I think it like symbolizes like a vessel that like starts off like empty and then like it became full with those who were enslaved, and as like those enslaved people were added to the boat becomes like full. So
okay, perfect. So and I think you're also hitting on the second. Go ahead, Kevin. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tagging along to what Eric said, it's kind of like it's filling up and it's getting too full to where the boat looks like it's being like stuffed, which is the pregnancy of it.
And you tapped on the third part as well, but also with the pregnancy portion, right? We have to keep in mind that this idea of relation is about a newness, right? And if you think about giving a birth of anything, whether it's a child, right, whether it's a new idea, right, whether it's music, it's a new production, right? And so for Glissant, the pregnancy aspect becomes important. The boat becoming pregnant becomes important because it places us to be attentive to the newness, right? This is why this idea of creolization becomes important, right? Because the language is being put together and mixed together produces a new form of language, right? So we have to be attentive to the new. And this is why the pregnancy portion of the boat becomes important. What are the three metamorphoses of the abyss? So before we get into the metamorphoses of the abyss, and we know that there's three of them, what is the abyss? How does Glissant define the abyss? It says it very specifically and very clearly what the abyss is.
Would the abyss be like the unknown or the undefined?
That's it, Ernesto. You're absolutely correct. He said the abyss is the unknown, 3 times unknown, right? And from the 3 times being unknown is where we get the 3 metamorphoses of the abyss. So perfect, Ernesto, you're spot on. What's the first metamorphosis of the abyss?
The womb.
Perfect, the womb abyss, perfect. The second metamorphosis of the abyss is what?
The water.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Nina. And what's the final metamorphosis of the abyss? Think back to your rear view mirror, right?
The entire like ocean, right?
Well,
it's like
all that's been left behind.
Yeah.
Right. So you're right in the sense that if you're on this ship, you're looking in the rear view mirror, you're going to see the ocean. But what he's saying is all that has been left behind that you will never be able to return to, even for generations. So not only the ocean that you've already traversed, right, but also your culture, also your home, right? All those things that you've been ripped from that you will not be able to go back to. That's the third metamorphosis of the abyss.
Would forgotten tradition be counted as one, or?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I do want to point out, right, while he says that that is a third metamorphosis of the abyss, and I agree with him, I don't want to overdetermine that reality, right? Like while these African people were going through these systems of oppression and enslavement, they tried very hard to maintain a lot of these customs, to maintain these languages, right? To maintain these spiritual practices and traditions. And a lot of them were successful at doing so. But I think Glissant's overall point is when you go through something like that, there will be things that are lost, right? And then finally, why is Glissant so attentive to relations? And I want to point you back to what I said about being the boat being pregnant as it pertains to Glissant's being attentive to relations. So why is Glissant so attentive to relations?
To highlight like those being enslaved, like trying to like make like a new language with each other, trying to like figure out what is going on in the boat because like it's constant fear. So they're trying to, so Glissant is trying to like link the like emotion between all those that were enslaved, that like emotion of fear in the boat.
And I think right where you're spot on, Kevin, is these things that happen, but how they produce this newness, right? This is why he's attentive to relations. This is why language becomes important, because he's seeing how language becomes mixed and it produces a new form of language, which is Creole. You can see how these customs that are predominant in the western portions of Africa get mixed within the bottom of the boat and produce these new forms of culture when they get into the Caribbean and Jamaica. We call it now Jamaican culture, right? But it's about the production of the new. This is why Glissant is concerned with relations. Any other questions? Well, actually, I'm sorry, before we go into that, thinking about Glissant, thinking about creolization, thinking about relations, thinking about the symbolism, thinking about the boat, which theoretical framework which fit both best with the work of Glissant, or helps you think about the work of Glissant? Someone besides Eric, Amanda, Kevin, and Jay.
Professor, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so based off what we discussed about Glissant and the poetics of relations, which theoretical framework helps you think about Glissant's work? African American male theory, critical race theories, kind of storytelling, the funds of knowledge, fugitivity. So I would like to hear from somebody who has not spoke today. Ernesto, go ahead.
I wanted to say critical race theory.
Okay.
It was just the fact that I read at the ending, which says retelling with great emphasis that histories of people of color that often go ignored. And since we're talking about the boats and like how this whole process was, I know, well, at least for me, often wasn't brought up exactly how it was, on the boats. And just the fact that we go into detail and actually are told what happens of how um, people were they were treated as not if they were human but inhuman. So I just wanted to talk about maybe that could be a connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to locate yourself, right? And then another way to think about counter storytelling as it pertains to Glissant, right? If it was not counter storytelling, you would be talking about those who were doing the enslaving, right? But because we're talking about the enslaved, right? You're talking about those who have been subjugated and oppressed. This properly places us within the paradigm or within the framework of counter storytelling. Personally, someone else, what framework goes? Go ahead, Kyle.
The African American theory goes with this text because it is proof that African American people were able to be resilient and resistant during like times of suffrage and extreme being deprived of all their rights, and how they have like grown resilient as a result.
Perfect. That's a great place to locate yourself. Perfect. Anyone else? There's one that's like very like speaks like leaps off the page to me, but anyone else?
Can I go?
Yeah, go for it.
Fugitivity,
Why fugitivity?
because they're stealing their identity by disregarding who they are as people and treating them so inhumanely. So
Okay, so let's unpack that. You're right. I was thinking fugitivity also, but so keep in mind the dynamics of who's doing the stealing, okay? In the context of fugitivity, because I get what you're thinking in the sense of they're stealing African people, right? That's what you're saying, who's doing the stealing, but fugitivity is the act of stealing yourself, right? This is the act of African people who were put in the position of being enslaved, stealing themselves from the plantation owners, right? So even when you talk about, remember how Glisson talks about the underwater signposts of African people who are thrown overboard, or and I say that sometimes they jumped overboard voluntarily. Those are acts of fugitivity, right? Because I don't know what's going to take place when I get off this ship, but I'm going to steal myself from experiencing that. So I'm jumping overboard, right? I don't know what's happening to me, why I'm being chained up, but I'm gonna engage in a fugitive act and speak to this person who is chained next to me that I'm not supposed to, so we can figure out what the fuck is going on, right? These are these acts of fugitivity that the African people employed to try to allow them to be, as Kyle points out, right, resistant and resilient, right? So you're absolutely right, Amanda, about the fugitivity, and you're right about the stealing part, right? But we want to focus on how African people stole their humanity back. That's where the essence of the fugitivity comes in at. Makes sense, but you're spot on, and I understand why you would equate them stealing with the Europeans still, like that. That makes absolute sense. But in the context of fugitivity, it's always about African people stealing or wresting their humanity back. Okay. Any questions? Any just general overall questions about the frameworks, about the midterm as a whole, about the format of the midterm? Just any general questions?
I need a clarification.
Okay.
So, the questions that we went over and the like the list of theories that we have, so those questions we're supposed to answer them like including like the answers have to include a theory in them.
Okay. So let me clarify for you, Lena. That's your study guide, right?
Right, yes.
The purpose of the study guide is to kind of help you think about the main themes of each reading, right? And that's why it's kind of listed out that way. So you can kind of conceptualize, okay, well, this is what A Water and Spirit's about through these questions. This is what Ngugi's about through these questions. If you can answer those questions, then you'll be prepared to answer the questions on the midterm, but there will be separate types of questions. You will have to use those theoretical frameworks that are listed to help support your answers to the midterm questions. Does that make sense?
It better. So, like as you said, this is a study guide, and then so like when we like the questions that are laid out, like it will help us like for the actual midterm, and like we can answer those questions easier, like
Correct.
using those theories, right?
Correct. So the idea
Okay.
is if you can answer all those questions on the study guide, you have no
Mhm.
problem answering the questions on the actual midterm. If you use those theories to help you answer the questions on the study guide, and you're comfortable with that process, then it'll be easy for you to use those theories to answer your questions on the actual midterm. You have to use those questions, you have to use those frameworks to help you answer those questions in the midterms, because you'll be getting points based on how you use those theories.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Any other questions about anything? Go ahead, Ernesto.
So, are you able to post the recording of today's lecture?
Yeah, what I'll do is probably give me to the end of tomorrow, and I'll post all of the recorded lectures, even the ones I haven't posted yet, so that way you could also use those to help you study the material as well. Also, use your journals, right? Like, again, this is a take-home midterm, right? You have it available on Thursday. You don't have to turn it in until Monday. So with it being take-home, use your resources that you have at home, right? Like, don't make it harder on yourselves. Like, I'm giving you these outs for a reason. Does that answer your question, Ernesto?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions, any other comments, any other concerns? So what we'll do on Wednesday is we'll go over the theoretical frameworks again. We'll discuss Ptahhotep's, the oldest book in the world, and then answer any other questions or concerns that you all may have. Please, please, please don't be bashful, don't be shy. This is a chance to get what you need so you feel comfortable. Before we go, I want to ask you all though, how do you feel now going into preparation for the midterm? Do you feel a little bit more comfortable about what to be expected? Yeah. All right. Cool. Enjoy the rest of your week. You all be safe, be healthy, be wealthy, be wise, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Peace.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Peace.
Have a good one, Professor.
All right, Fabian, have a good one, man.
Have a good one, Professor.
All right, next, have a good one.